Hello, I'm Professor Bidit Day, welcoming you to this edition of the Persecution Report, a podcast dedicated to uncovering the truth behind the current situations in Bangladesh. The events in Bangladesh during August 2024, culminating in the establishment of an unconstitutional and illegal interim government led by Yunus, will be remembered as the greatest scam in the nation's history. As the political landscape continues to reveal a series of unexpected developments characterized by deception and unfulfilled promises, the economic sector stands as a testament to the profound incompetence and the chaos that the regime can only offer. Initially hailed as a reformist alternative, Yunus administration has failed to stabilize the country amid widespread unrest, economic downturn, and institutional erosion. The transition to the military-backed installation of Yunus as chief advisor has miserably failed to create an atmosphere and ecosystems that enable businesses to thrive. GDP growth has plummeted in a 36-year low. Inflation remains stubbornly high at over 9%, and local and foreign investment have stalled. Economic indicators paint a grim picture of the country's trajectory under this regime. Real GDP growth is forecasted to fall to just 3.3%, which is 4.2% last year. Inflation has surged, which I've already mentioned, with food prices in particular rising over 7.6%. And unemployment, particularly amongst youth, has reached an alarming high, with over 28% youth population currently are jobless in Bangladesh. Investment confidence has eroded due to political instability, high interest rates, and disrupted supply chains. The garment sector, once hailed as the backbone of the nation's export economy, has been hit hard by factory closures, declining orders, and rising production costs. Approximately 400 garments factories have shut down in the last 1 year, leaving nearly 120,000 workers unemployed. Mainly, many of them were employed in facilities and factories owned by Bangladesh Awami League party leaders and their affiliates, clearly demonstrating a possible political motivation behind this disastrous situation. In summary, we are currently experiencing a period in which the business landscape and economy of the nation have been adversely affected by the regime's profound incompetence, ignorant dogmas which they pretend to have, and a lack of strategic vision. To engage in a comprehensive discussion on this matter, we have assembled a panel of experts. Let me introduce you with the panel members today. We have Dr. Mamun Rashid, economist and researcher. We have Dr. Tashfin Hussain, Professor of Finance, and we have Mr. Anwar Shaddad Jihan, aerospace engineer and columnist. May I request Mr. Jihan to take us through some of these stats and information about the current economic climate in Bangladesh. Over to you, Mr. Jihan.
Thank you, Mr. Day, for connecting me today. We have among us two subject matter experts. I would like to welcome Dr. Rashid and Dr. Hussain to our show, and many thanks for your time. Now, from Henry Kissinger's infamous label of Bangladesh as a basket case to its recognition as a rising tiger, from the miracle of economic transformation to today's stagflation, the story of Bangladesh is one of striking contrast. If we trace the historical timeline of Bangladesh, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. In Bangladesh, the single defining factor between progress and decline, between hope and despair, and between prosperity and crisis has been the leadership of Bangabandhu's daughter, Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. She transformed the economic destiny of Bangladesh with her bold vision, determination, and discipline. Even her harshest critics used to wonder what magic does this Iron Lady possess. Yet, last year, very abruptly and forcefully, the Sheikh Hasina factor was removed from Bangladesh. The result, The economy of Bangladesh is in free fall. Let us examine some of the key macroeconomic indicators that economic experts use to analyze the economic health of a country. Before our experts dive deeper, let me give you a simple comparison between the time when Sheikh Hasina assumed office and she left. When Sheikh Hasina took charge in 2008, the GDP, the nominal GDP of Bangladesh stood at around 91 billion US dollar. And by the time she left, it soared to a whopping $450 billion. Under her leadership, the real GDP growth consistently rose from 5-6% to well over 8%, marking the fastest growth rate in a developing world. Bangladesh was doing great. The world took notice, and Bangladesh was being hailed as a story of economic resilience. But today, in 2025, the GDP growth has plummeted to 3.5%, according to the government data. It is in reality even lower, which our experts will discuss in detail. If we look at the inflation, we will see a similar pattern. When Sheikh Hasina took over, the inflation was around 10%. But through prudent fiscal management, her government successfully brought it down to a healthy 5.65%. Then the unthinkable COVID pandemic happened. The whole world took a hit. Bangladesh was no exception. However, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina very adroitly steered the country through this storm, and she was stabilizing the economy. But then she was removed. And today, the inflation is hovering around 10%, the highest in South Asia. And according to experts, the reasons behind these high inflations are currency depreciation, delayed and weak monetary policy response, and supply chain disruptions, and above all, political instability. In 2008, Bangladesh's foreign reserves were a modest 7.47 billion US dollar. But under the Awami League government, they climbed an unprecedented $46.39 billion in June 2021, a record in Bangladesh's history. But today, the reserves have dropped to 30.85 billion US dollar. And when calculating using the IMF BPM6 method, it is 25 billion US dollars. So there is a discrepancy between these two numbers. And our experts will dive deeper into this discrepancy to show you guys how the Yunus government is deceiving the world, the citizen of the country. Look at the export data, it also tells a similar tale. In 2008, Bangladesh's exported goods were worth around 15 to 17 billion dollar. Under Sheikh Hasina's leadership, even amid the pandemic, exports soared to around 59 billion dollar in 2022. But today, with Awami League gone, that success story is evaporating. In 2025, exports have fallen to $48 billion. Industries are closing, factories are burning, production is collapsing. On the other hand, the import has soared, marking a widening trade gap, a weakening currency, and a very unstable economy. Now, to Bangabandhu, to the father of the nation, the main focus was the fate of the Bengali people. And under Sheikh Hasina, we were close towards this dream. The poverty rate of Bangladesh was brought down from somewhere around 31% to 20%. And the extreme poverty was also similar. However, After the removal of the Awami League government, today the poverty rate again soared. It stands around 28%. That means more than one people out of four are poor today in Bangladesh. And we are seeing reports of food insecurity, that more than 20 million people are at risk of facing severe food insecurity. And lastly, if we look at the corruption index of Bangladesh, Bangladesh is a developing country, so corruption is nothing new in Bangladesh. However, under the Awami League government, the corruption index of Bangladesh was in a comparable state with its South Asian counterpart. But let us not forget from where we came. Under the BMP Jamaat government, Bangladesh was a champion. A champion in what? A champion in corruption. And in 2025, we are back to square one. Corruption is through the roof. So looking at all these indicators, the economy of Bangladesh
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Jihan, for your comprehensive and very insightful presentation. Now, I would like to bring Dr. Rashid in the discussion. So with regard to what we see as the general economic indicators, and normally we use those indicators to assess the current situation. And of course, we look at the GDP growth rate as well as inflation. So we can see, as Mr. Jihan presented, and also I mentioned in my introductory speech, that the real GDP is declining. The GDP growth is actually a 36-year low, as well as the inflation is almost like 10%. So how would you assess the situation from an economist's point of view? Over to you, Dr. Rashid.
Thank you very much, Professor Day. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to thank also our audience to take this time and listen to us. As we know and we have seen, the condition in Bangladesh, especially the economic condition, and also connected to the social condition, is deteriorating day by day. For the last 1 year, or slightly more than 1 year, since August 5, 2024, there has been a number of changes in the economic forecasts that we have updated you recently a number of times. Starting with GDP, the gross domestic products, which basically translates simply into number of products or quantity of products and services that we produce in a country in a year, and then convert it to a certain currency. You can do it in your local currency, Bangladeshi taka, or can convert it to US dollar. So the total GDP indicates two things in a simple way. First is your production opportunity. Therefore, what's your capacity in terms of production? So GDP takes you actually back to, your entire storage or entire capacity of land, labor, capital, for example, in terms of the basic factors of production. And then added to these would be, for service sector, you have knowledge, you have technology, and others combined together. How much is the total amount that you're producing in a year? Now, there's the first one. So the stock of production, stock of number of products multiplied by prices would be total GDP in terms of product and services. The other thing that GDP indicates, or the stock of GDP indicates, or the growth of GDP indicates, is also your reputation. The perception of the people about you. So if you are progressing, generally there's a positive impression about you, about your country, about your production system, about your labor management system, about your capital formation inside the country. So eventually you give a collective positive response to outsider that I have the capacity to produce. And combining these two together for Bangladesh is an amazing picture that you have seen, that we have grown from 79 to 80 billion dollars to 450, 460 billion dollars. And now this story has been supported not only by the amount of resources that you see, or some of the industries that we have developed over the years. For example, the ready-made garments industry. We have some other emerging industries coming up. We have some exports in the pharmaceuticals and also some light industries, light machineries and industrial export as well. However, the real truth of the story behind this production and the growth has been leadership, obviously, negotiation, leadership, talking to outsiders, creating a positive impression about the country. And to support this, you have seen a massive growth of infrastructure in the country. And as you perhaps know, that production cannot be supported without having necessary infrastructure in the country. Some of these we often see for take it for criticisms. For example, the big Podda Bridge and also Chittagong Tunnel. We have the third terminal extension of the airport and some other infrastructure similar to that. There are, I think, thousands of these bridges and culverts being developed and redeveloped. We have also railway connections, and some of these logistics are also helping us to connect to the neighboring countries to ease these production facilities, bringing raw materials into the country, and also supplying them whenever necessary to other countries. And you also know about our shipping ports. There are a lot of discussions going on right now about shipping ports in Bangladesh, whether these are being also given to foreigners to run, even though these were successful. So controlling your resources, making the best use of those resources, and eventually you get the result of 450-60 billion dollars of GDP. Now, there has been reports in the recent time. You have seen those that the GDP growth by multiple multilateral agencies, including World Bank, IMF, ADB, that our GDP growth rate is falling from around average 6% achieved during Sheikh Hasina's regime to near about 3%, 3.5%. And there has been a number of rumors as well that this is the GDP rate, that is the GDP rate. So there is no single straightforward answer from any of these institutions what is going to happen to Bangladesh in the near future. This is one of the major problems. Why? Because as I mentioned, that GDP gives a signal to outsiders. So if you are giving confusing signals, you do not know what is the actual GDP, what is the stock of your capital, what is your capacity to produce. So eventually foreigners, those are expected to be your investors, will be holding back investments because they are no investors, no foreign investors generally invest in an uncertain scenario. We are expecting an election, and I hope that there will be an election soon in order to bring back the democratic regime. So unless this democracy comes back, the foreign investors will not be confident to come into Bangladesh and invest. Now, at this scenario, do we actually have the capacity to achieve the GDP forecast? For example, near about 5% or 3.2% to 5.2% GDP forecast that has been forwarded to us by the Yunus regime. My personal opinion, and from the estimations that we have seen in the past, for example, the last year, well, Bangladesh has the capacity. The problem is the way we have, created an intentional destruction using mobs, using arson, and these are intentional destruction. So, and structural destruction as well. So, if we continue to do this, added to already negative confidence about Bangladesh, about politics in Bangladesh, about the social dynamics about Bangladesh. Now, if I continue to add this negative response given to the foreign investors, obviously this forecast of 3% may not be possible in the future. So this year, we may have a massive shock of GDP forecast. The last information about GDP is that how much we have lost so far. If Sheikh Hasina would have been continuing, if you remember when Yunus regime took control of Bangladesh hastily, they didn't have any complaint about country's GDP growth. They didn't have any complaint about country's economy growth. Even though Dr. Yunus been to World Economic Forum during March 2025, most probably, if you remember, he mentioned that Bangladesh's economic growth figures were fake. It is unfortunate that he is relying on the same figures now to say that Bangladesh is growing. Now, the unfortunate aspect of this is that when the leader of the country creates such a reputational hazard for a country, you do not expect foreign investors from a person of his stare, to take a positive message about a country. So you are intentionally creating negative messages about the country. And then the most important aspect, as I was mentioning, is if we were at the rate of 6% now, that Sheikh Hasina very comfortably achieved for a number of years. Even she went up, achieving at 8%, 7.78%, 6.5%. If we are achieving it at 6%, two information let me share with you. First one is, over the next 10 years, Bangladesh could easily achieve a $1 trillion economy benchmark. So we could easily go up to that level. $1 trillion economy, you are in a completely different club. You have a different status now. But unfortunately, we couldn't do it. The second information related to this is, if we are achieving at 6% and currently achieving, say, around 3% or 3.5%, per year, for the first year, I can tell you we lost around $15 to $17 billion only in GDP. And if I take a present value of the next 5 years, as many of our people are shouting that they want Yunus for 5 years, if you keep him for 5 years, only GDP loss at the current rate, if the situation maintains, it doesn't deteriorate anymore, we are going to lose around $170 billion in 5 years, only from GDP. There are many other areas where we will be losing, and this will have a spiral impact on the three conventional factors of production: land, labor, capital, the use of land, the use of labor forces. As you have seen, and possibly we'll discuss it later, there's a massive impact on unemployment, and there are a lot of people unemployed right now. And obviously, it will lead to poverty. So we'll also discuss about poverty in a short while. Back to you, Professor Day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rashid. Just briefly, I would like to request you to touch on the inflation side of this story. So we know that during COVID time, there was a massive global inflation because of disrupted supply chains. And also US government's federal rate was increased, which had a domino effect on other countries' trade, bilateral trade, and also on their respective inflation situation. And then we had Ukraine war, which also impacted on the global economic climate. But we also saw that during this period, a very turbulent period between 2020 and 2024. And I have to remind you that also that 2023-24 was the election year. So there was also a bit of uncertainty about the then opposition party would come to the election and how things would pan out. So given those uncertainties, given those challenges, do you think that the previous government under the leadership of Sheikh Hasina did reasonably well to stabilize? And now that we can see the inflation is again having an upward rise. So what's your take about that?
Thank you. There are a number of issues about inflation. Let us define it in a very simple manner. There are two sides of inflation, actually. The first one that we often see is the rise in price levels, general price levels. That's a very simple definition of inflation. So if your prices increases, we say that the difference is often characterized as the inflation rate or changes in CPI, Consumer Price Index. On the other hand, there is another explanation of inflation rate, that is the reduction of your purchasing power. So meaning that if the price level changes and there are not sufficient supply of products to the market, meaning that you are using too much of money to buy less amount of or less quantity of products, meaning that you are losing purchasing power of your money. Now, the third important thing that we often miss, and we don't often cover it in our academic classes as well, is that reduction of inflation rate does not directly make your situation better. So let me explain. For example, if your inflation rate reduces from 10% to 8%, your prices are still increasing by 8%. So it's not going to be zero price or going back to $100 to $100. It is still increasing at 8%. The only difference is it was increasing previously by 10%, now increasing by 2% less. So people often think that, well, inflation is decreasing, meaning that prices tomorrow morning will go back to zero. No, it's not going back to zero. That's the third thing. The fourth thing is, if you remember, one of the major crises that this Yunus government started with was relatively high inflation rate. And that high inflation rate came from two major crises. One was the COVID-19, during which the global inflationary scenario was extremely bad. To cite few examples, in the UK, I think you also have experienced very high inflation rate during that time. The governments all over the world had to adjust their policy rates because of the high inflation rate. Now, the other thing is the following the COVID-19 pandemic, we started with, or we fell into Russia-Ukraine crisis from February 2022. Now, I think more than the COVID, the Russia-Ukraine crisis was more, or having more profound impact on the inflation rate scenario because of the control of Ukraine on the global supply of commodities. So if you have lesser supply or shorter supplies, definitely the prices will go up, and you need to spend more money. You need to borrow more in order to buy those commodities, and that eventually led to shortage of dollars for Bangladesh government, because Bangladesh was this relatively smaller economy. Even though it was emerging, it was growing at a fast rate, but it had to make a lot of sacrifices in order to save dollars. So that was the time. If you relate this to our foreign currency balance that we will take a look at later on, our foreign currency reserve also fell significantly during that time because of this crisis, which actually politicized by the current governor, the Bangladesh Bank governor, saying that Awami League, or the leaders of Awami League, siphoned money out of the country, and that's why the foreign currency reserve fell, which is not true. So going back to inflation rate or inflation, we have now still inflation rate very close to 10%, and which has been flagged by a number of multilateral agencies, including IMF recently, that our inflation rate is again going out of hand. And for the last 3 months, I think inflation rate is increasing. And I also do not trust the inflation figures; those are being shared, honestly. Now, the inflation rate, the reason why we have all these crises, let me take you through for a minute or so about inflation, how that having an impact on the other economic variable. So when Yunus government took this initiative to control inflation, the first thing that they did was they controlled the money supply. Well, the usual suspect is money supply. You control the money supply, you gradually reduce the inflation rate. However, what they did, um, or they deceived the people, I should say, is that Sheikh Hasina regime actually started contractionary monetary policy even before Yunus. So when Bangladesh Bank governor criticized Sheikh Hasina's policy that they cut down import too much, they actually did exactly the same time, but same thing, cutting down import. So, but they just for the for the sake of blaming Sheikh Hasina regime, they said that Sheikh Hasina regime destroyed Bangladesh's consumption and growth. But they did exactly the same thing. From July, what Bangladesh government did, July 2025, they introduced, or they theoretically introduced, expansionary monetary policy, meaning that they will supply more money to the market. Now, what happened in between is when the money supply was cut, meaning that you are now supplying less money to private sector. At the same time, since the government was not earning much money, that means their tax returns or tax earning through NBR, the National Board of Revenue, and other income are decreasing, they were actually borrowing significantly from the market. So the portion of the money being supplied to the Bangladesh market was actually borrowed by Bangladesh Bank for the purpose of government operation. That's why you have seen recently that in a video I have published that the Bangladeshi banks, even the good banks, were actually having a negative profit from their regular operation, but they were having extremely positive profit by simply investing in government's treasury bond. So government has raised a massive amount of money, basically took out the money being supplied by the government from the market. They balanced the inflation rate. They also imported products from India at a very low price and supplied that to the market. But what happened in between is you have destroyed the industrial sector. You have destroyed the industrial growth because you have reduced our industrial machinery import to the lowest in 21 years. Private sector growth was the lowest in 21 years. LC of industrial machineries were lowest in 4 years. Our consumption growth were one of the lowest in 4 years. that eventually led to unemployment, higher unemployment, and also poverty. So control of inflation mismanaged for a longer period of time, they mismanaged it, eventually led to poverty. And I believe this is intentionally done
So
because
it's effectively a sort of a sticking plaster strategy rather than going for a more concerted and long-term and sustained decision about how to recover from inflation. So they were just sticking plasters here and there to do some short-term recovery, which is certainly not working at all. Thank you very much, Dr. Rashid. Of course, we will be having detailed discussion about the investment scenario, and in another episode, we will also talk about the banking sector. If we have time, we can also quickly reflect on that. Now, over to you, Dr. Hussain. That we can see that there is a tendency of deceiving information, and in the whole spectrum of these economic uncertainties, where does the politics stand, and how the political figures who are leading the country right now are maneuvering the whole scenario? And do you see that there is a kind of a vicious effort of fabricating information, manipulating information, and where necessary, stopping flawed information? Over to you, Dr. Hussain.
Thank you, Professor Bidit, for inviting me in this show. I think first Anwar Sadat and then Dr. Mamoon have done a fantastic job in terms of explaining how methodically the economic indicators are have gone down. Now, I'm not going to get into that analysis. I'm just going to talk about from a very different angle. First of all, if we even consider that, for the sake of the argument, that the Sheikh Hasina-led Awami League government was a fascist regime, then during that regime of that fascist government, we have seen a lot of criticisms about the government in the press of Bangladesh, in both the TV media and electronic media, right? Now, in a typical fascist regime, you don't see that, but we have seen that. And there was a lot of criticism regarding the monetary policy of Bangladesh government. There's a lot of criticisms regarding inflation. There was a lot of negative news regarding corruption and whatnot. We have all seen that, right? So now, if this was a very fascist regime, then how come we have seen all those news? And I have seen in some of the talk shows, although I do not see a lot of talk shows, but in some of the talk shows that I've seen, I have seen the some of the researchers, well-known researchers in the socio-economic spectrum of Bangladesh. They have often criticized the policies of the Awami League government. Correct? Now, and there was a lot of fabrication of the news. There was a lot of misrepresentation of the facts. A lot of the times, the criticisms that happened about the Awami League's economic policy or performance or even the financial sector, those were based during the COVID time. Now, everybody needs to understand what happened during the COVID time. This was a global shutdown. And some of us who have been living in US, in Canada, and some of the European countries, which are the, really strong countries, we know that we are still recovering from that. We have yet to recover from that impact of COVID in Canada, in US, and in Japan, and some of the really what we call the most developed countries in the world, right? So there was fabrication, and there was a selection of what kind of data I am picking. So was I really looking into the overall performance of the Awami League government during the, whatever, 10, 15 years that they were? No, I was cherry picking the indicators, right? Number one. Number two, when this government came to power, Now, again, for the sake of the argument, let's say Awami League was a fascist government, so this fascist government was replaced by the interim government. My first question is, why are they trying to say that under them the economy is doing better? And I want everybody to think about it. Why are they saying that? Because their mandate is not to rule the country for another 5 years, correct? I mean, usually when we have a democratic election, we have a 5-year government. Why they are trying to do that? Are they trying to tell us? Because usually when you have a democratic government, and that government usually compares their performance, socioeconomic performance with the past government, just to show that we are doing better, right? Because they want to be there for 5 years, they want to get reelected, and that's fine. Why is this government trying to do that? First of all, why is this government trying to basically always say that we are managing the economy better than the previous government? They do not have to. And we have heard from Dr. Mamun Rashid that, Dr. Yunus has said this in several in several platforms, that Awami League has destroyed the economy. The others are giving different kind of data that Bangladesh Bank governor has criticized. And basically they are trying to say that, okay, we have a destroyed economy and we are trying to do better. They do not have to do that because that's not their mandate, number one. And everybody needs to understand that, right? Their mandate was to basically, take over this, they take over the government and come up with a democratic election. They have not done that, and they will not be able to do that unless the election is very inclusive. A fair election without the participation of the major political parties in Bangladesh cannot be an inclusive election, cannot be a democratic election. So I fear that no matter what kind of election that we are going to have, it's not going to resolve the problem. Second of all, that during the so-called fascist regime, we had so much criticism of government's policy. How come we are not seeing that? Some of the data that Anwar has shown today, and some of the analysis that Dr. Mamun has presented, I do not think that those analyses can be actually aired in the, let's say, some of the TV channels in Bangladesh, in the printed media of Bangladesh. You cannot. And if you are an economist, or you are saying this in let's say somewhere in some platform in Bangladesh, there is every possibility that somebody from the government actually will send a mob to your house. So basically, there is much more censorship. There is no independence of the voices of the policy analysis analytic people. And when we heard about from these economists before, they were sometimes praising Awami League government, they were sometimes criticizing Awami League government. They do not have that freedom at all today. So what is a fascist regime? If we look at the fascist regime, I wonder whether we can call Awami League's time as a fascist regime. And today, what I see is a mixture of, fascism that was practiced in Italy, then coupled with the propaganda that the Nazi regime started in Germany. So you have a propaganda machine, which is led by Yunus, and it's all about some kind of stunts. Sometimes you will see that they will say, oh, this company is coming, or that thing is coming, right? Those are economic stunts. And this was very well done in Germany during the Nazi regime by Goebbels. And then in Mussolini's fascist Italy, nobody could say anything. Nobody could criticize, right, the fascist government. And that's exactly what we have right now. So actually, we have been replaced by, I do not know if this was a fascist regime, but definitely whatever regime that we had, we have been replaced by a fascist regime.
Yeah, I mean, you have very aptly and eloquently explained. And that's been a matter of discussion over the last 14 months since the very first day of this government, the way they have dealt with opposition parties, they have dealt with the progressive people, cultural activists, and of course the country's economy. That does not give us an impression that this government has democratic spirit in them. So over to you, Dr. Rashid, again. And Dr. Hussain has actually raised a very interesting dimension in terms of the manipulation of the data. And I know that you have done some research on the foreign currency reserve and how this has been completely misinterpreted and misrepresented in the current media. Over to you, Dr. Rashid.
Thank you, Professor Day. Let me start with remittance. So, as you know, that among the two major inputs to our GDP income and our status as Bangladesh, the first one is ready-made garments, the second one is remittance. And we have remittance income coming from number of countries, and this has been our struggle and our development, part of our development for over 35 to 40 years. And this industry, meaning that this remittance industry or the Bangladeshi workers working in different countries, this industry took over 35 to 40 years to come to this stage. Now, how, as Professor just recently, you have seen that there are number of occasions where we have reports that our workers are not given visas, their visas being rejected, and also not their visas are not extended in number of Middle Eastern countries. Now, in terms of remittance, the discrepancy was that some of these economic variables are political variables, including GDP is a political variable, remittance is a major political variable in Bangladesh. So how much remittance you are bringing into the country is a major political variable. So that's why this has been kind of like publicized by every government in the past. Yunus government obviously is no exception to this. From the very beginning, they try to portray that they are bringing more remittance. But the first thing here is that remittance, again, is increasing because our workers are in different countries. We are sending more workers in different countries. However, in the last 1 year, number of workers that we have sent to other countries decreased by at least 200,000 per year. During Sheikh Hasina's time, we sent over 12 lakh, so 1.2 million a year. It's a minimum average, and now it is less than 1 million. So and we know the reason why. The labeling of extremist in Malaysia on our workers, Islamic extremism, religious extremism, and others. This has been labeled globally, and there is now negative impression everywhere about our workers. The second thing is there are figures about remittance that the growth of remittance over the last at least 3 months, these are going down. And this is obviously, we know why, because less number of people going outside, and that's why we are not receiving that much of remittance. But the lie and deception that I would like to raise here is our remittance now increased to almost $30 billion per year. It was last year $24 billion. Now, it is quite suspicious that in a year when there is massive crisis in international labor market, especially about Bangladeshi workers, how come your remittance suddenly jump up $6 billion in a year when people are rejecting your visas? So I have done some research, and I found that this remittance also came through a very unoccasional source, very traditional source, that is through our government banks. Normally, we receive major portion of our remittances through private banks. But this $6 billion, this additional $6 billion actually came through our government banks. And this is my suspicion, is that these $6 billion are also connected to the foreign loans that we have collected from other countries and institutions, meaning that they have cooked the books with the same figure again and again.
And also that the same distance, sorry to interject, and the same difference we can see in the foreign currency reserve, which was 30 billion in August. And during the same time, we got $1.5 billion from the IMF as loan. So do you see that there is a connection?
I think yes, because this is exactly the same time and almost a similar amount increase in different indicators, and the money is coming from outside. Also, foreign currency reserve increased from $25.8 billion to $31.8 billion in a month. The $6 billion growth in a month is not a matter of joke. It just doesn't come, from fall from the sky. Somebody cooked the book. They are not telling us the right figure. So, or this is the same figure that they have been cooking in different books. So this deception has been happening with GDP. It is happening with inflation. It's happening with remittance. It's happening with foreign currency reserve. So if I take out this $6 billion that being added from loans, $25.8 billion, or the figure around that, is actually lower than what Sheikh Hasina left a year ago. So Sheikh Hasina left almost the same figure or more than that a year ago in total foreign currency reserve. So the marketing that they have done over the last 1 year, that the foreign currency reserve has gone up, where is that? Where is that money? That means this money either being siphoned out of the country, billions of dollars being transferred to other countries. We do not know because everything is under control. Now you see that we are importing rice, Indian rice, from Dubai. So this is another textbook example. Those of us teach economics, we know transfer pricing, we know arm's length corruption of transferring money to other countries. So these are textbook example of transferring foreign currencies to other countries. Now nobody is raising question about under invoicing, over invoicing, why we are buying sugar from Pakistan when Pakistan buys sugar from India, why we are buying rice from Dubai when Dubai doesn't have any cultivation of rice. They buy it from India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and other countries. Why we are not buying these from our neighboring countries? Say, for example, some we are buying from Myanmar, but we could easily go to Thailand or Indonesia. But Thailand and Indonesian markets are not that friendly for transferring money or siphoning money to those countries. Dubai is a destination often chosen by foreign investors to transfer money and invest in Dubai. So it's very clear that through foreign currency reserve that has been deceived, they're deceiving us over the last 1 year with these figures. Do you have any other question, Professor Day?
Thank you very much. Briefly, I'm conscious of time. For viewers, we will have an extended session. We will do it again in a few weeks' time, sometime end of November, when the same panelists will be here to talk about the investment scenario as well as the market situation, particularly the stock market and the banking sector. But I have to actually touch on the poverty, the rise of poverty and food security very briefly, Dr. Rashid, and then I'll go to Dr. Hussain one last time. Over to you, please.
Let me cover this very quickly. Poverty is one of the major economic indicators of any country. Now, Bangladesh has done a splendid job over the last 15 years. I can give you some anecdotes. It actually started in 1996 with Sheikh Hasina government, and that started with Mr. Shams Kibriya. If you remember him, late Shams Kibriya, he was assassinated. During his reign, he actually started or redesigned Awami League's economic policy towards rural development, towards rural empowerment, and also an economic development based on poverty reduction. That's where we started. And that's where you see today the Millennium Development Goals that we have, the foundation of the rural Bangladesh that we see actually came from there. And we were extremely lucky that in the next session, when Sheikh Hasina took power in 2009, there came the magical man, Abul Mal Abdul Muhit, another late visionary leader, at the same time, very much practitioner. He had experience in every sphere of the government administration with financial institutions and all. This person also continued, Mr. Abul Mal Abdul Muhit, continued the journey and even made it better. So his major contribution actually was the lower debt to GDP ratio. he concentrated on internal resource mobilization, using our internal resources in order to generate more resources for the nation. So that's how we see the poverty situation reduced to actually 4.1% in 2024. That figure was not, again, deception. It was not reported by PPSC report by Hossein Zillur. What Hossein Zillur did, they used the 2022 report that was our, the benchmark report they used, and it reported 5.1% of poverty, the core poverty, extreme poverty. So at that time, it was a total of 5.1%, actually reduced to less than 5%, extreme poverty. Now we see a scenario of extreme plus vulnerable poverty of total of 28%, 27 plus 28%. That is an estimation. So my expectation is it goes easily to 30 plus percentage if you take the real data. Now that was again 6 months ago, and the data was actually taken like 9 months ago. Now, if you consider the recent scenario, the poverty scenario goes easily close to 50%. Now, this 50% would be divided into, for example, 15% of extreme poverty, that you see that almost 10 million people will be affected, more than 10 million people will be affected by extreme food shortages. Plus, there are vulnerable people. One of the advisors, Professor Waiduddin Mahmood, added that 18% of the people, those are vulnerable, in the poverty class, they will be poor as well. Now, this poor doesn't mean that you are not only buying your, struggling to buy your food. You are actually stopping all other investments. You are bringing your kids from school, stopping their schooling. You have seen these figures output in our national results. Kids are not going back to school. 50% of our girls, those are receiving stipends for education from primary schooling and a schooling system. They did not receive, they did not collect. It's not the word receive. They did not collect their stipend, meaning that they are not interested to go to school, or the parents do not have the confidence that they will send their girls to school because of the poor law and order situation. Bangladesh was one of the fourth largest producer of most of the food and grains that we eat. Now Bangladesh is the fourth largest country in terms of food shortages. Fourth largest
Thank
country.
you. Thank you, Dr. Rashid.
Just one sentence. The three other countries before us are Nigeria, Sudan. The crisis in Sudan now. So these are the
Yes.
countries before us. Back to you, Professor Day.
Thank you very much. That's a very grim situation. But in the last sentence, just before you finished, Dr. Rashid, you mentioned about the social security. Food security is inextricably connected with social security. We have seen mob violence. We have seen rise of extremism. And that also puts our women population in vulnerable situation. That puts our poor people in vulnerable situation. Dr. Hussain, where do you see the countries moving from here?
Yeah, I'm very conscious about the time. So this is what I'm going to say, that the situation right now is really, really bad. In a very layman's word, it's really, really bad. The economic situation, the other socio-political situation is really bad. So since we are talking about the economy, is there any chance that the economic situation will improve? Well, for any country to have any kind of economic growth, the first thing that you need to have is you need to have a friendly economic environment. We don't have that. We have an economics of fear right now. Okay, there have been, hundreds of factories have been arsoned, correct? Factories that have been destroyed by mob. So when you have a situation like that, it does not matter whether you are an investor from Bangladesh or whether you are a foreign investor, you are not going to invest in the country. And I'm sure that as an economist, Dr. Mahmood Rashid would agree that without these investments in the private sector and a prudent management of the economy by the public sector, there is no sign that there is no way that we are going to actually have a better economic position in years to come. So I do not see any kind of positives that are coming out. What I only see that what this regime is trying to do is this regime is trying to fabricate as much information as possible. And we really need to think about what is their goal. What is actually their goal? Why do they need to do that? If they actually had the intention of transferring power to a democratically elected government, they wouldn't have to do that. But they are doing that right now and putting the country's economy in really a very,
And
very...
also, do you think that this political uncertainty, every single day we are seeing all sorts of dramas happening, and that doesn't help to develop investors' confidence?
Exactly. And that Dr. Mahmood Rashid talked about Dr. Wahiduddin Mahmood. I remember Dr. Wahiduddin Mahmood used to actually criticize Amali government's economic policies a lot, right? How come he's not doing that right now? Because he's an advisor, so that's how his mouth has been shut. Is that the basic model that we are following, right? So and really, when the main philosopher of your government is a student, and I do not think like he was a really brilliant student. I have not heard about his brilliance. Maybe my mistake. And you have people like that. What kind of really economic future you are expecting for the country?
Thank you very much, my dear panelists. Dear viewers, thus far we have heard from our esteemed panelists that the country is in real danger. Our panelists have painted a troubling portrait of our economy in stark contrast to the denials propagated by Yunus and his supporters. We are regrettably sleepwalking toward a severe economic crisis marked by high unemployment, inflation, sluggish GDP growth, declining investment, and looming food insecurity. These are genuine risks, and there are genuine risks of civil unrest and widespread chaos that could be ignited by complete economic collapse. The international community, the likes of IMF and World Bank, they have already sounded the alarm. Now is the time for us as a nation to unite against this evil regime and their perverse ideas. We are in a race against time before the economic time bomb inevitably explodes. Dear all, stay well, stay safe, stay informed. I'm Professor Bidit Day signing off. Until next time, thank you very much.